This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giripala Joshi.
Chapter 9 Wanderings Among the Kisans. I spent 3 days in the villages, came back to Allahabad, and then went again. During these brief visits, we wandered about a great deal from village to village, feeding with the peasants, living with them in their mud huts, talking to them for long hours, and often addressing meetings, big and small. We had originally gone in a light car, and the peasants were so keen that hundreds of them, working overnight, built temporary roads across the fields so that our car could go right into the interior. Often the car got stuck and was bodily lifted out by scores of willing hands. But we had to leave the car eventually, and to do most of our journeying by foot. Everywhere we went, we were accompanied by policemen, CID men, and a deputy collector from Lucknow. I am afraid we gave them a bad time with our continuous marching across fields, and they were quite tired out and fed up with us and the Kisans. The deputy collector was a somewhat effeminate youth from Lucknow, and he had turned up in patent leather pumps. He begged us sometimes to restrain our ardor, and he ultimately dropped out, being unable to keep up with us. It was the hottest time of the year, June, just before the monsoon. The sun scorched and blinded. I was quite unused to going out in the sun, and ever since my return from England I had gone to the hills for part of every summer. And now I was wandering about all day in the open sun with not even a sun hat, my head being wrapped in a small towel. So full was I of other matters that I quite forgot about the heat. And it was only on my return to Allahabad, when I noticed the rich tan I had developed, that I remembered what I had gone through. I was pleased with myself, for I realized that I could stand the heat with the best of them, and my fear of it was wholly unjustified. I have found that I can bear both extreme heat and great cold without much discomfort, and this has stood me in good stead in my work as well as in my periods in prison. This was no doubt due to my general physical fitness and my habit of taking exercise, a lesson I learned from my father, who was a bit of an athlete, and almost to the end of his days continued his daily exercise. His head became covered with silvery hair, his face was deeply furrowed and looked old and weary with thought, but the rest of his body, to within a year or two of his death, seemed to be 20 years younger. Even before my visit to Partabgarh in June 1920, I had often passed through villages, stopped there and talked to the peasants. I had seen them in their scores of thousands on the banks of the Ganges during the big melas, and we had taken our home rule propaganda to them. But somehow I had not fully realized what they were and what they meant to India. Like most of us, I took them for granted. This realization came to me during these Partabgarh visits, and ever since then my mental picture of India always contains this naked, hungry mass. Perhaps there was some kind of electricity in the air, perhaps I was in a receptive frame of mind, and the pictures I saw and the impressions I gathered were indelibly impressed on my mind. These peasants took away the shyness from me and taught me to speak in public. Till then I hardly spoke at a public gathering. I was frightened at the prospect, especially if the speaking was to be done in Hindustani, as it almost always was. But I could not possibly avoid addressing these peasant gatherings, and how could I be shy of these poor, unsophisticated people? I did not know the arts of oratory, and so I spoke to them man to man, and told them what I had in my mind and in my heart. Whether the gathering consisted of a few persons or of 10,000 or more, I stuck to my conversational and rather personal method of speaking, and I found that, whatever might be lacking in it, I could at least go on. I was fluent enough. Perhaps many of them could not understand a great deal of what I said. My language or my thought was not simple enough for them. Many did not hear me when the gathering was very large, for my voice did not carry far. But all this did not matter much to them when once they had given their confidence and faith to a person. I went back to Mussoorie to my mother and wife, but my mind was full of the Kisans, and I was eager to be back. As soon as I returned, I resumed my visits to the villages and watched the agrarian movement grow in strength. The downtrodden Kisan began to gain a new confidence in himself and walked straighter with head up. his fear of the landlord's agents and the police lessened, and when there was an ejectment from a holding, no other Kisan would make an offer for that land.
Physical violence on the part of the zamindar's servants
and illegal exactions became infrequent, and whenever an instance occurred, it was immediately reported and an attempt at an inquiry was held. This checked the zamindar's agents as well as the police. The talukdars were frightened and were on the defensive, and the provincial government promised an amendment of the Awadh tenancy law. The talukdars and the big zamindars, the lords of the land, the natural leaders of the people, as they are proud of calling themselves, had been the spoilt children of the British government. But that government had succeeded by the special education and upbringing it provided, or failed to provide for them, in reducing them, as a class, to a state of complete intellectual impotence. They did nothing at all for their tenantry, such as landlords in other countries have to some little extent often done, and became complete parasites on the land and the people. Their chief activity lay in endeavoring to placate the local officials, without whose favor they could not exist for long, and demanding ceaselessly a protection of their special interests and privileges. The word zamindar is rather deceptive, and one is apt to think that all zamindars are big landlords. In the Rayatwari provinces it means the peasant proprietor. Even in the typical zamindari provinces, it includes in its fold the relatively few big landlords, thousands of middle landowners, and hundreds of thousands of persons who live in extreme poverty and are no better than tenants. In the United Provinces, so far as I can remember, there are 1.5 million persons classed as zamindars. Probably over 90% of these are almost on the same level as the poorest tenants, and another 9% are only moderately well off. The biggest landowners are not more than 5,000 in the whole province, and of this number, about 1/10 might be considered the really big zamindars and talukdars. In some instances, the bigger tenants are better off than the destitute petty landowners. Both these poor landowners and the middle landlords, though often intellectually backward, are as a whole a fine body of men and women, and with proper education and training can be made into excellent citizens. They have taken a considerable part in the nationalist movement. Not so the talukdars and the big zamindars, barring a few notable exceptions. They have not even the virtues of an aristocracy. As a class they are physically and intellectually degenerate and have outlived their day. They will continue only so long as an external power like the British government props them up. Right through the year 1921, I continued my visits to the rural areas, but my field of activity grew till it comprised the whole of the United Provinces. Non-cooperation had begun in earnest, and its message had reached the remotest village. A host of Congress workers in each district went about the rural areas with the new message, to which they often added, rather vaguely, a removal of Kisan grievances. Swaraj was an all-embracing word to cover everything. Yet the two movements, non-cooperation and the agrarian, were quite separate, though they overlapped and influenced each other greatly in our province. As a result of Congress preaching, litigation went down with a rush, and villages established their panchayats to deal with their disputes. Especially powerful was the influence of the Congress in favor of peace, for the new creed of non-violence was stressed wherever the Congress worker went. This may not have been fully appreciated or understood, but it did prevent the peasantry from taking to violence. This was no small result. Agrarian upheavals are notoriously violent, leading to jackeries, and the peasants of Partabgarh in those days were desperate and at white heat. A spark would have lighted a flame. Yet they remained amazingly peaceful. The only instance of physical violence on a talukdar that I remember was when a peasant went up to him as he was sitting in his own house, surrounded by his friends, and slapped him on the face on the ground that he was immoral and inconsiderate to his own wife. There was violence of another kind later, which led to conflicts with the government. But this conflict was bound to come, for the government could not tolerate this growing power of a united peasantry. The Kisans took to travelling in railway trains in large numbers without tickets, especially when they had to attend their periodical big mass meetings, which sometimes consisted of 60 or 70,000 persons. It was difficult to move them, and, unheard of thing, they openly defied the railway authorities, telling them that the old days were gone. At whose instigation they took to the free mass travelling I do not know. We had not suggested it to them. We suddenly heard that they were doing it. Stricter railway control prevented this later. In the autumn of 1920, when I was away in Calcutta attending the special session of the Congress, a few Kisan leaders were arrested for some petty offence. They were to be tried in Partabgarh town, but on the day of the trial a huge concourse of peasants filled the court compound and lined the route to the jail where the accused leaders were kept. The magistrate's nerve gave way, and he postponed the trial to the next day. But the crowd grew and almost surrounded the jail. The Kisans can easily carry on for a few days on a handful of parched gram. Ultimately, the Kisan leaders were discharged, perhaps after a formal trial, inside the jail. I forget how this came about, but for the Kisans, this was a great triumph, and they began to think that they could always have their way by weight of numbers alone. To the government, this position was intolerable, and soon after a similar occasion arose, and this time it ended differently. It was at the beginning of January 1921. I had just returned to Allahabad from the Nagpur Congress when I received a telegram from Rae Bareli asking me to go there immediately, as trouble was expected. I left the next day. I discovered that some leading Kisans had been arrested some days back and had been lodged in the local jail. Remembering their success at Partabgarh and the tactics they had then adopted, the peasants marched to Rae Bareli town for a mass demonstration. But this time the government was not going to permit it, and additional police and military had been collected to stop the Kisans. Just outside the town on the other side of a little river, the main body of the Kisans was stopped. Many of them, however, streamed in from other directions. On arrival at the station, I learnt of this situation, and immediately I proceeded straight to the river where the military were said to face the peasants. On the way, I received a hurriedly written note from the district magistrate asking me to go back. I wrote my reply on the back of it, inquiring under what law and what section he was asking me to go back. Until I heard from him, I proposed to go on. As I reached the river, sounds of firing could be heard from the other side. I was stopped at the bridge by the military, and as I waited there, I was suddenly surrounded by large numbers of frightened Kisans who had been hiding in the fields on this side of the river. So I held a meeting of about a couple of thousand peasants on the spot and tried to remove their fear and lessen their excitement. It was rather an unusual situation with firing going on their brethren within a stone's throw across a little stream, and the military in evidence everywhere. But the meeting was quite successful and took away the edge from the Kisans' fear. The district magistrate then returned from the firing line, and at his request I accompanied him to his house. There he kept me, under some pretext or other, for over 2 hours, evidently wanting to keep me away from the Kisans and my colleagues in the city. We found later that many men had been killed in the firing. The Kisans had refused to disperse or to go back, but otherwise they had been perfectly peaceful. I am quite sure that if I or someone else they trusted had been there and had asked them to do so, they would have dispersed. They refused to take their orders from men they did not trust. Someone actually suggested to the magistrate to wait for me a little, but he refused. He could not permit an agitator to succeed where he had failed. That is not the way of foreign governments depending on prestige. Firing on Kisans took place on 2 occasions in Rae Bareli district about that time, and then began, what was much worse, a reign of terror for every prominent Kisan worker or member of a panchayat. Government had decided to crush the movement. Hand spinning on the charkha was then spreading among the peasantry at the instance of the Congress. A charkha therefore became the symbol of sedition, and its owner got into trouble, the charkha itself being often burned. Thus, the government tried to crush by hundreds of arrests and other methods both the agrarian and the Congress movements in the rural areas of Rae Bareli and Partabgarh. Most of the principal workers were common to the two movements. A little later, in the year 1921, Faizabad district had its dose of widespread repression. The trouble started there in a peculiar way. The peasants of some villages went and looted the property of a talukdar. It transpired subsequently that they had been incited to do so by the servants of another zamindar who had some kind of feud with the talukdar. The poor ignorant peasants were actually told that it was the wish of Mahatma Gandhi that they should loot, and they willingly agreed to carry out this behest, shouting "Mahatma Gandhi ki jai" in the process. I was very angry when I heard of this, and within a day or two of the occurrence I was on the spot, somewhere near Akbarpur in Faizabad district. On arrival, I called a meeting for the same day, and within a few hours 5,000 or 6,000 persons had collected from numerous villages within a radius of 10 miles. I spoke harshly to them for the shame they had brought on themselves and our cause, and said that the guilty persons must confess publicly. I was full in those days of what I conceived to be the spirit of Gandhiji's Satyagraha. I called upon those who had participated in the looting to raise their hands, and strange to say, there, in the presence of numerous police officials, about 24 hands went up. That meant certain trouble for them. When I spoke to many of them privately later, and heard their artless story of how they had been misled, I felt very sorry for them, and I began to regret having exposed these foolish and simple folk to long terms of imprisonment. But the people who suffered were not just 2 or 3 dozen. The chance was too good to be lost, and full advantage was taken of the occasion to crush the agrarian movement in that district. Over 1,000 arrests were made, and the district jail was overcrowded, and the trial went on for the best part of a year. Many died in prison during the trial. Many others received long sentences, and in later years, when I went to prison, I came across some of them, boys and young men, spending their youth in prison. The Indian Kisans have little staying power, little energy to resist for long. Famines and epidemics come and slay them in their millions. It was surprising that they had shown for a whole year great powers of resistance against the combined pressure of government and landlord. But they began to weary a little, and the determined attack of the government on their movement ultimately broke its spirit for the time being, but it continued still in a lower key. There were not such vast demonstrations as before, but most villages contained old workers who had not been terrorized and who carried on the work in a small way. All this, it must be remembered, was prior to the jail going, which the Congress started at the end of 1921. Even in this the Kisans took a considerable part, in spite of all they had suffered during the previous year. Frightened by the agrarian movement, the government had hurried on with tenancy legislation. This promised some improvement in the lot of the Kisan, but the measure was toned down when it was found that the movement was already under control.
The principal change it effected was to give a life tenancy to the Kisan in Awadh.
This sounded attractive to him, but, as he has found out subsequently, his lot is in no way better. Agrarian troubles continued to crop up
In Awadh,
but on a smaller scale. The world depression, which began in 1929, however, again created a great crisis owing to the fall in prices. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Non-cooperation. I have dealt with the Awadh agrarian upheaval in some little detail because it lifted the veil and disclosed a fundamental aspect of the Indian problem to me to which nationalists had paid hardly any attention. Agrarian troubles are frequently taking place in various parts of India, symptoms of a deep-seated unrest,
and the Kisan agitation in certain parts of Awadh
in 1920 and 1921 was but one of them, though it was, in its own way, a remarkable and a revealing one. In its origin, it was entirely unconnected with politics or politicians, and right through its course, the influence of outsiders and politicians was of the slightest. From an all-India point of view, however, it was a local affair and very little attention was paid to it. Even the newspapers of the United Provinces largely ignored it. For their editors and the majority of their town-dwelling readers, the doings of mobs of semi-naked peasants had no real political or other significance. The Punjab and the Khilafat wrongs were the topics of the day, and non-cooperation, which was to attempt to bring about a righting of these wrongs, was the all-absorbing subject. The larger issue of national freedom or Swaraj was for the moment not stressed. Gandhiji disliked vague and big objectives. He always preferred concentrating on something specific and definite. Nevertheless, Swaraj was very much in the air and in people's thoughts, and frequent reference was made to it in innumerable gatherings and conferences. In the autumn of 1920, a special session of the Congress met at Calcutta to consider what steps should be taken, and in particular to decide about non-cooperation. Lala Lajpat Rai, freshly back from the United States, after a long absence from home, was the president. He disliked the newfangled proposal of non-cooperation and opposed it. He was usually considered an extremist in Indian politics, but his general outlook was definitely constitutional and moderate. Force of circumstances and not choice or convictions had made him an ally of
Lokmanya Tilak
and other extremists in the early days of the century. But he had a social and economic outlook, strengthened by his long residence abroad, and this gave him a broader vision than that of most Indian leaders. Wilfrid Scowen Blunt, in his diaries, describes an interview he had, about 1909, with Gokhale and Lalaji. He is very hard on both, considering them far too cautious and afraid of facing realities. And yet, Lalaji faced them far more than most Indian leaders. Blunt's impressions make us realize how low was the temper of our politics and our leaders at that time, and how an able and experienced foreigner was struck by them. But a decade had made a great difference to that temper. Lala Lajpat Rai was not alone in his opposition. He had a great and impressive company with him. Indeed, almost the entire old guard of the Congress opposed Gandhiji's resolution of non-cooperation. Mr. C.R. Das led the opposition, not because he disapproved of the spirit behind the resolution, for he was prepared to go as far or even farther, but chiefly because he objected to the boycott of the new legislatures. Of the prominent leaders of the older generation, my father was the only one to take his stand by Gandhiji at that time. It was no easy matter for him to do so. He sensed and was much influenced by the objections that had led most of his old colleagues to oppose. He hesitated, as they did, to take a novel step towards an unknown region, where it was hardly possible to keep one's old bearings. Yet he was inevitably drawn to some form of effective action, and the proposal did embody definite action, though not exactly on the lines of his thought. It took him a long time to make up his mind. He had long talks with Gandhiji and Mr. C.R. Das. Mr. Das and he were thrown a great deal together just then, as they were both appearing on opposite sides in a big Mofussil case. They looked at the problem from much the same point of view, and there was very little difference between them even as regards the conclusion. Yet that little difference was just enough to keep them on either side of the main resolution at the special Congress. 3 months later, they met again at the Nagpur Congress, and from then onwards they pulled together, ever coming nearer to each other. I saw very little of father in those days before the Calcutta Special Congress, but whenever I met him, I noticed how he was continually grappling with this problem. Quite apart from the national aspect of the question, there was the personal aspect. Non-cooperation meant his withdrawing from his legal practice. It meant a total break with his past life and a new fashioning of it. Not an easy matter when one is on the eve of one's 60th birthday. It was a break from old political colleagues, from his profession, from the social life to which he had grown accustomed, and a giving up of many an expensive habit which he had grown into. For the financial aspect of the question was not an unimportant one, and it was obvious that he would have to reduce his standard of living if his income from his profession vanished. But his reason, his strong sense of self-respect, and his pride all led him step by step to throw in his lot wholeheartedly with the new movement. The accumulated anger with which a series of events, culminating in the Punjab tragedy and its aftermath, filled him, the sense of utter wrongdoing and injustice, the bitterness of national humiliation, had to find some way out. But he was not to be swept away by a wave of enthusiasm. It was only when his reason, backed by the trained mind of a lawyer, had weighed all the pros and cons that he took the final decision and joined Gandhiji in his campaign. He was attracted by Gandhiji as a man, and that no doubt was a factor which influenced him. Nothing could have made him a close associate of a person he disliked, for he was always strong in his likes and dislikes. But it was a strange combination: the saint, the stoic, the man of religion, one who went through life rejecting what it offers in the way of sensation and physical pleasure, and one who had been a bit of an epicure, who accepted life and welcomed and enjoyed its many sensations, and cared little for what may come in the hereafter. In the language of psychoanalysis, it was a meeting of an introvert with an extrovert. Yet there were common bonds, common interests, which drew the two together and kept up, even when, in later years, their politics diverged, a close friendship between them. Walter Pater, in one of his books, mentions how the saint and the epicure, starting from opposed points, travelling different paths, one with a religious temper, the other opposed to it, and yet both with an outlook which, in its stress and earnestness, is very unlike any lower development of temper, often understand each other better than either would understand the mere man of the world, and sometimes they actually touch. This special session at Calcutta began the Gandhi era in Congress politics, which has lasted since then, except for a period in the 20s when he kept in the background and allowed the Swaraj Party, under the leadership of
Deshbandhu, C.R. Das, and my father,
to fill the picture. The whole look of the Congress changed. European clothes vanished, and soon only
khadi was to be seen.
A new class of delegate, chiefly drawn from the lower middle classes, became the type of congressman. The language used became increasingly Hindustani, or sometimes the language of the province where the session was held, as many of the delegates did not understand English, and there was also a growing prejudice against using a foreign language in our national work. And a new life and enthusiasm and earnestness became evident in Congress gatherings. After the Congress was over, Gandhiji paid a visit to the veteran editor of the
Amrit Bazar Patrika, Sri Motilal Ghosh,
who was lying on his deathbed. I accompanied him.
Motilal Babu blessed Gandhiji and his movement.
And he added that, as for himself, he was going away to other regions, and wherever these might be, he had one great satisfaction: he would be somewhere where the British Empire did not exist. At last he would be beyond the reach of this empire.
On our way back from the Calcutta Special Congress, I accompanied Gandhiji to Shantiniketan on a visit to Rabindranath Tagore and his most lovable elder brother, Boro Dada.
We spent some days there, and I remember C.F. Andrews giving me some books which interested and influenced me greatly. They dealt with the economic aspects of imperialism in Africa. One of these books, Morell's Black Man's Burden, moved me greatly. About this time or a little later, C.F. Andrews wrote a pamphlet advocating independence for India. I think it was called Independence: The Immediate Need. This was a brilliant essay based on some of Seeley's writings on India, and it seemed to me not only to make out an unanswerable case for independence, but also to mirror the inmost recesses of our hearts. The deep urge that moved us and our half-formed desires seemed to take clear shape in his simple and earnest language. There was no economic background or socialism in what he had written. It was nationalism pure and simple, the feeling of the humiliation of India and a fierce desire to be rid of it and to put an end to our continuing degradation. It was wonderful that C.F. Andrews, a foreigner and one belonging to the dominant race in India, should echo that cry of our inmost being. Non-cooperation was essentially, as Seeley had said long ago, the notion that it was shameful to assist the foreigner in maintaining his domination. and Andrews had written that the only way of self-recovery was through some vital upheaval from within. The explosive force needed for such an upheaval must be generated within the soul of India itself. It could not come through loans and gifts and grants and concessions and proclamations from without. It must come from within. Therefore, it was with the intense joy of mental and spiritual deliverance from an intolerable burden that I watched the actual outbreak of such an inner explosive force as that which actually occurred when Mahatma Gandhi spoke to the heart of India the mantram, "Be free, be slaves no more," and the heart of India responded. In a sudden movement her fetters began to be loosened and the pathway of freedom was opened. The next 3 months witnessed the advancing tide of non-cooperation all over the country. The appeal for a boycott of the elections to the new legislatures was remarkably successful. It did not and could not prevent everybody from going to these councils and thus keep the seats vacant. Even a handful of voters could elect, or there might be an unopposed election. But the great majority of voters abstained from voting, and all who cared for the vehemently expressed sense of the country refrained from standing as candidates. Sir Valentine Kirol happened to be in Allahabad on the election day, and he made a round of the polling booths. He returned amazed at the efficiency of the boycott. At one rural polling station, about 15 miles from Allahabad city, he found that not a single voter had appeared. He gives an account of his experiences in one of his books on India. The wisdom of this boycott had been questioned by Mr. C.R. Das and others at the Calcutta session, but they stood by the Congress decision. The elections being over, this point of difference was removed, and the next full session of the Congress at Nagpur in December 1920 saw a reunion of many of the old Congress leaders on the plank of non-cooperation. The very success of the movement had convinced many a doubter and waverer.
A few old leaders, however, dropped out of the Congress after Calcutta, and among these, a popular and a well-known figure was that of Mr. M.A. Jinnah.
Sarojini Naidu had called him the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, and he had been largely responsible in the past for bringing the Muslim League nearer to the Congress.
But the new developments in the Congress, non-cooperation, and the new constitution, which made it more of a popular and a mass organization, were thoroughly disapproved of by him.
He disagreed on political grounds, but it was not politics in the main that kept him away. There were still many people in the Congress who were politically even less advanced than he was. But temperamentally, he did not fit in at all with the new Congress. He felt completely out of his element in the khadi-clad crowd demanding speeches in Hindustani. The enthusiasm of the people outside struck him as mob hysteria. There was as much difference between him and the Indian masses as between Savile Row and Bond Street, and the Indian village with its mud huts. He suggested once privately that only matriculates should be taken into the Congress. I do not know if he was serious in making this remarkable suggestion, but it was in harmony with his general outlook. So he drifted away from the Congress and became a rather solitary figure in Indian politics. Later, unhappily, the old ambassador of unity associated himself with the most reactionary elements in Muslim communalism. The moderates or liberals had of course nothing to do with the Congress. They not only kept away from it, they merged themselves in the government, became ministers and high officials under the new scheme, and helped in fighting non-cooperation and the Congress. They had obtained almost what they desired, some reforms had been granted, and so there was no need for them to agitate. While the country was seething with excitement and becoming more and more revolutionary, they became frankly counter-revolutionary, a part of the government itself. They were completely cut off from the people and developed a habit, which has persisted since, of looking at problems from the official point of view. They ceased to be a party in any real sense, and became a small number of individuals dotted about in a few big cities. Mr. Srinivas Shastri became an imperial envoy, visiting, at the instance of the British government, various British dominions as well as the United States of America, and strongly criticizing the Congress and his own countrymen for the struggle they were carrying on against that government. And yet the Liberals were far from happy. It is not a pleasant experience to be cut off from one's own people, to sense hostility even though one may not see it or hear it. A mass upheaval is not kind to the nonconformists, though Gandhiji's repeated warnings made non-cooperation far milder and gentler to its opponents than it otherwise would have been. But even so, the very atmosphere stifled those who opposed the movement, just as it invigorated and filled with life and energy those who supported it. Mass upheavals and real revolutionary movements always have this double effect. They encourage and bring out the personality of those who constitute the masses or side with them, and at the same time they suppress psychologically and stifle those who differ from them. This was the reason why some people complained that non-cooperation was intolerant and tended to introduce a dead uniformity of opinion and action. There was truth in this complaint, but the truth lay in this, that non-cooperation was a mass movement, and it was led by a man of commanding personality who inspired devotion in India's millions. A more vital truth, however, lay in its effect on the masses. There was a tremendous feeling of release there, a throwing off of a great burden, a new sense of freedom. The fear that had crushed them retired into the background, and they straightened their backs and raised their heads. Even in remote bazaars the common folk talked of the Congress
and Swaraj,
for the Nagpur Congress had finally made Swaraj the goal, and what had happened in the Punjab
and the Khilafat.
But the word
Khilafat
bore a strange meaning in most of the rural areas. People thought it came from
Khilaf,
an Urdu word meaning against or opposed to, and so they took it to mean opposed to government. They discussed, of course, especially their own particular economic grievances. Innumerable meetings and conferences added greatly to their political education. Many of us who worked for the Congress program lived in a kind of intoxication during the year 1921. We were full of excitement and optimism and a buoyant enthusiasm. We sensed the happiness of a person crusading for a cause. We were not troubled with doubts or hesitation. Our path seemed to lie clear in front of us, and we marched ahead, lifted up by the enthusiasm of others, and helping to push on others. We worked hard, harder than we had ever done before, for we knew that the conflict with the government would come soon, and we wanted to do as much as possible before we were removed. Above all, we had a sense of freedom and a pride in that freedom. The old feeling of oppression and frustration was completely gone. There was no more whispering, no roundabout legal phraseology to avoid getting into trouble with the authorities. We said what we felt and shouted it out from the housetops. What did we care for the consequences?
prison.
We looked forward to it. That would help our cause still further. The innumerable spies and secret service men who used to surround us and follow us about became rather pitiable individuals, as there was nothing secret for them to discover. All our cards were always on the table. We had not only a feeling of satisfaction at doing effective political work, which was changing the face of India before our eyes, and, as we believed, bringing Indian freedom very near, but also an agreeable sense of moral superiority over our opponents, both in regard to our goal and our methods. We were proud of our leader and of the unique method he had evolved, and often we indulged in fits of self-righteousness. In the midst of strife, and while we ourselves encouraged that strife, we had a sense of inner peace. As our morale grew, that of the government went down. They did not understand what was happening. It seemed that the old world they knew in India was toppling down. There was a new aggressive spirit abroad and self-reliance and fearlessness, and the great prop of British rule in India, prestige, was visibly wilting. Repression in a small way only strengthened the movement, and the government hesitated for long before it would take action against the big leaders. It did not know what the consequences might be. Was the Indian army reliable? Would the police carry out orders? As Lord Reading, the Viceroy, said in December 1921, they were puzzled and perplexed. An interesting circular was sent confidentially by the UP government to its district officers in the summer of 1921. This circular, which was published later in a newspaper, stated with sorrow that the initiative was always with the enemy, meaning the Congress, and this was an unfortunate state of affairs. Various methods were then suggested to regain the initiative, among them being the starting of those ludicrous bodies, Aman Sabhas. It was believed that this particular method of combating non-cooperation was adopted at the suggestion of the Liberal ministers. The nerves of many a British official began to give way. The strain was great. There was this ever-growing opposition and spirit of defiance which overshadowed official India like a vast monsoon cloud, and yet because of its peaceful methods it offered no handle, no grip, no opportunity for forcible suppression. The average Englishman did not believe in the bona fides of non-violence. He thought that all this was camouflage, a cloak to cover some vast secret design which would burst out in violent upheaval one day. Nurtured from childhood in the widespread belief that the East is a mysterious place, and in its bazaars and narrow lanes secret conspiracies are being continually hatched, the Englishman can seldom think straight on matters relating to these lands of supposed mystery. He never makes an attempt to understand that somewhat obvious and very unmysterious person, the Easterner. He keeps well away from him, gets his ideas about him from tales abounding in spies and secret societies, and then allows his imagination to run riot. So it was in the Punjab early in April 1919 when a sudden fear overwhelmed the authorities and the English people generally, made them see danger everywhere, a widespread rising, a second mutiny with its frightful massacres, and, in a blind, instinctive attempt at self-preservation at any cost, led them to that frightfulness of which Jallianwala and the crawling lane of Amritsar have become symbols and bywords. The year 1921 was a year of great tension, and there was much to irritate and annoy and unnerve the official. What was actually happening was bad enough, but what was imagined was far worse. I remember an instance which illustrates this riot of the imagination. My sister Swaroop's wedding, which was taking place at Allahabad, was fixed for the 10th May 1921, the actual date having been calculated, as usual on such occasions, by a reference to the Samvat calendar, and an auspicious day chosen. Gandhiji and a number of leading congressmen, including the Ali brothers, had been invited, and to suit their convenience, a meeting of the Congress Working Committee was fixed at Allahabad about that time. The local congressmen wanted to profit by the presence of famous leaders from outside, and so they organized a district conference on a big scale, expecting a large number of peasants from the surrounding rural areas. There was a great deal of bustle and excitement in Allahabad on account of these political gatherings. This had a remarkable effect on the nerves of some people. I learnt one day through a barrister friend that many English people were thoroughly upset and expected some sudden upheaval in the city. They distrusted their Indian servants and carried about revolvers in their pockets. It was even said privately that the Allahabad fort was kept in readiness for the English colony to retire there in case of need. I was much surprised and could not make out why anyone should contemplate the possibility of a rising in the sleepy and peaceful city of Allahabad just when the very apostle of non-violence was going to visit us. Oh, it was said, May 10th, the day accidentally fixed for my sister's marriage, was the anniversary of the outbreak of the mutiny at Meerut in 1857, and this was going to be celebrated. Owing to the prominence given to the Khilafat movement in 1921, a large number of Maulvis and Muslim religious leaders took a prominent part in the political struggle. They gave a definite religious tinge to the movement, and Muslims generally were greatly influenced by it. Many a westernized Muslim who was not of a particularly religious turn of mind began to grow a beard and otherwise conform to the tenets of orthodoxy. The influence and prestige of the Maulvis, which had been gradually declining owing to new ideas and a progressive westernization, began to grow again and dominate the Muslim community. The Ali brothers, themselves of a religious turn of mind, helped in this process, and so did Gandhiji, who paid the greatest regard to the Maulvis and the Maulanas. Gandhiji, indeed, was continually laying stress on the religious and spiritual side of the movement. His religion was not dogmatic, but it did mean a definitely religious outlook on life, and the whole movement was strongly influenced by this and took on a revivalist character so far as the masses were concerned. the great majority of Congress workers naturally tried to model themselves after their leader and even repeated his language. And yet Gandhiji's leading colleagues in the working committee, my father, Deshbandhu Das, Lala Lajpat Rai and others, were not men of religion in the ordinary sense of the word, and they considered political problems on the political plane only. In their public utterances they did not bring in religion. But whatever they said had far less influence than the force of their personal example. Had they not given up a great deal that the world values and taken to simpler ways of living? This in itself was taken as a sign of religion and helped in spreading the atmosphere of revivalism. I used to be troubled sometimes at the growth of this religious element in our politics, both on the Hindu and the Muslim side. I did not like it at all. Much that Maulvis and Maulanas and Swamis and the like said in their public addresses seemed to me most unfortunate. Their history and sociology and economics appeared to me all wrong, and the religious twist that was given to everything prevented all clear thinking. Even some of Gandhiji's phrases sometimes jarred upon me, thus his frequent reference to Ramraj as a golden age which was to return. But I was powerless to intervene, and I consoled myself with the thought that Gandhiji used the words because they were well known and understood by the masses. He had an amazing knack of reaching the heart of the people. But I did not worry myself much over these matters. I was too full of my work and the progress of our movement to care for such trifles, as I thought at the time they were. A vast movement had all sorts and kinds of people in it, and so long as our main direction was correct, a few eddies and backwaters did not matter. As for Gandhiji himself, he was a very difficult person to understand. Sometimes his language was almost incomprehensible to an average modern. But we felt that we knew him quite well enough to realize that he was a great and unique man and a glorious leader, and having put our faith in him, we gave him an almost blank check, for the time being at least. Often we discussed his fads and peculiarities among ourselves and said, half humorously, that when Swaraj came, these fads must not be encouraged. Many of us, however, were too much under his influence in political and other matters to remain wholly immune even in the sphere of religion. Where a direct attack might not have succeeded, many an indirect approach went a long way to undermine the defenses. The outward ways of religion did not appeal to me, and above all I disliked the exploitation of the people by the so-called men of religion, but still I toned down towards it. I came nearer to a religious frame of mind in 1921 than at any other time since my early boyhood. Even so, I did not come very near. What I admired was the moral and ethical side of our movement and of
Satyagraha.
I did not give an absolute allegiance to the doctrine of non-violence or accept it forever, but it attracted me more and more, and the belief grew upon me that, situated as we were in India and with our background and traditions, it was the right policy for us. The spiritualization of politics, using the word not in its narrow religious sense, seemed to me a fine idea. A worthy end should have worthy means leading up to it. That seemed not only a good ethical doctrine, but sound, practical politics, for the means that are not good often defeat the end in view and raise new problems and difficulties. And then it seemed so unbecoming, so degrading to the self-respect of an individual or a nation to submit to such means, to go through the mire. How can one escape being sullied by it? How can we march ahead swiftly and with dignity if we stoop or crawl? Such were my thoughts then, and the non-cooperation movement offered me what I wanted, the goal of national freedom and, as I thought, the ending of the exploitation of the underdog, and the means which satisfied my moral sense and gave me a sense of personal freedom. So great was this personal satisfaction that even a possibility of failure did not count for much, for such failure could only be temporary. I did not understand or feel drawn to the metaphysical part
of the Bhagavad Gita,
but I liked to read the verses, recited every evening in Gandhiji's ashram prayers, which say what a man should be like, calm of purpose, serene and unmoved, doing his job and not caring overmuch for the result of his action. Not being very calm or detached myself, I suppose, this ideal appealed to me all the more.
End of chapter 10.